Hi, I have finally downloaded a different kind of software which hopefully will make these lectures a little bit easier. So I'm going to go over some of the big concepts that we've been talking about up through chapter 8, and this will be kind of a lead into another lecture that will cover the rest of the chapters that we need to know for the midterm. So be looking for part 2 of this. And the objective of this is to just kind of hit some of the big concepts and ideas that we didn't get to talk about directly. I think the book is very thorough, and please do know that I pull questions from the text. The midterm will be mostly looking at your comprehension, your ability to compare different concepts and write short essays in response to them. So if you don't understand a concept, make that a priority. Either ask me about it or spend some time with your text in order to really grasp it. In the meantime, let's go on through some things that I wanted to hit on but haven't been able to address directly with you recently. Nope. There we go. One of the things that we have talked about a little bit is what it means to be a good political scientist, and we discuss kind of what role objectivity and what role ethics or morality should play in your assessment of good political science. And so here are just some major concepts to hit on. In the end, I don't require you to draw a firm line on it must be entirely scientific or it must be entirely ethical. I think that you will find political science is a blend of both those considerations, as was outlined in the chapter dealing with sound prudential judgment. And one of the things that you need to be able to do in being a good political scientist is understand correlation versus causality. You may see that two things happen at the same time consistently, but that does not necessarily mean that they cause each other. You have to be able to draw a direct line from one event as the cause and the other event as the result to show causality. So just because you're showing two things simultaneously may mean they're correlated, does not mean they're causality. The other thing you need to be able to do, as was again I think outlined pretty effectively by our text, is integrate values versus opinion in sound prudential judgment. So you can have values and you can have an opinion. However, values are usually based on a larger objective truth outside of yourself. An opinion is based on yourself and what you think, what you feel. And so I would set values as the higher goal here. You're seeking to form values that are not just in your own self-interest, but in the self-interest of the best political life, of the best conditions and systems for humanity. The forming of an opinion can be done in a very scientific way based on verifiable evidence, and this is the best way to form an opinion, is to look at evidence that can be empirically shown, and through this to justify your opinions about the type of government that should exist, the type of laws that should exist, the way they should be enforced, the role of government in personal lives. Those kinds of opinions are opinions that should be backed up with knowledge, and I hope that this class is kind of the foundational knowledge for you in terms of that. The forming of your opinion must also include evaluation of ethical components, and as I said before, the ethical components are those things that are important to all of humanity, not just to yourself. The other thing that is part of being a good political scientist is research the opposing viewpoint. You do not stop with forming your own viewpoint with just reading one perspective and saying, that sounds good. All right, I'm done. That's not where it ends. You have to look at the opposing viewpoint, and you have to construct arguments to defeat the various points within that opposing viewpoint if you want to maintain your opinion. If you cannot construct arguments that defeat that opposing viewpoint, then you have to consider that opposing viewpoint as valid and potentially a more convincing opinion than the one that you hold. Again, this is all just part of being a good political scientist, a good social scientist, really, of any kind. So I wanted to lay that groundwork. Let's go on here. One of the things we never got a chance to directly address, but that a lot of you brought up in your reading responses, was why Hitler came to power. Now, in hindsight, it seems just completely unthinkable because we are living so many years after the fact. We are looking back at the atrocities that Hitler and the Third Reich committed. It's very clear to us that this person never should have held power. However, that is the privilege of sitting at this point in history and looking backwards. What we need to do in order to understand why we reached this point in history as humanity and why people did allow it to happen is understand some of the root causes behind it. And I think that chapter 8 goes into this effectively, but I want to summarize some of the major concepts just to clarify for any of you that are still wondering, how could this have ever happened? Let's talk about that. One of the things that existed at the time that Hitler became chancellor was subsistence level politics. And I use that term to relate to a subsistence level economy. Basically, people were starving. I interviewed a German couple who were children at the time that Hitler came to power. So of course, I mean, they had no awareness of his political agenda or anything like that. All that they knew at that time was that before Hitler came to power, they were hungry. After Hitler came to power, they were well fed. And that is just subsistence level decision making. People were making decisions about survival. So you have to understand that with Hitler came financial stability, which came a far better quality of life, and people were able to move beyond just subsistence, just survival. This is very important in solidifying the power that a leader may have. The more physically comfortable people are, the more well-established and strong that power is going to be. The other thing that we need to balance here is the need for security and financial stability, which ultimately resulted in fascism. I will go into this more a little bit further on in the lecture, and your book goes into it too. But there is a consistent balance between security and liberty, and different types of governments are going to help establish one versus the other. You cannot have infinite security and infinite liberty. Those two exist on a spectrum, and you can have a lot of one and very little of the other, or a lot of the other and very little of the first. Those are your options. So at this point in German history, there was very little security. There was very little stability within economics, within the political system. This resulted in the rise of fascism, which is a very stable type of political system. And so it gave people precisely what they were lacking. It took away liberty, to be sure, but at the time that was not the highest value on people's minds. The highest value was stability. Oh, something fell upstairs. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is just a statement of fact, is that homogeneous societies are more stable societies. Now, Hitler exploited this knowledge in his attempt to create what we now know and call the master race. This is a social fact that the more similar people are to each other, the less conflict there will be. You won't have cultural considerations. You won't have language barriers. You won't have economic disparity. You won't have as many misunderstandings. So the more homogenous a society, the more peaceful it is, and this tends to make people happier with their living situation. I think you see very often in societies such as Northern Europe, they are very homogenous, and there's very little conflict compared to other regions of the world which have a lot of diversity. Now, this has the negative impact of people resisting diversity. And you see this playing out particularly with the resistance to accepting refugees into countries which they're economically stable. They have the space, they have the means to care for refugees, but they're very resistant to this threat to the homogeneity. They know that different cultures, different ideals, different ways of life are coming in to their political system, and there's going to be conflict related to that. So rather than finding ways to work with diversity and create a more representative political structure that can still function in spite of not being homogenous, they are opting to rather resist diversity from entering their political borders. And thus you see the European resistance to receiving refugees from Syria as a contemporary example. The Third Reich, of course, is an example of totalitarianism. And this is where government impacts all aspects of life. There is extreme government power. There is very little personal liberty, but a lot of security. And the government controls all aspects of life. Now, I should specify that there is all security for those who follow and adhere to the prescripted norms of the totalitarian regime. So anyone who breaks the law, anyone who does not conform to certain things, which of course in this case we know race, ethnicity was a major factor. And so they are not secure under a totalitarian regime. But for those who fall under this homogenous umbrella and who follow the laws of the land, they actually experience a lot of safety, very little crime. This is also an example of ultranationalism. We talked about, or the book rather, talked about how nationalism, when carried to extremes, results in ultranationalism. And that is this extreme loyalty to one's country or nation and placed high above all other value systems. And those value systems may include basic human rights. So what you see is an exploitation of this ultranationalistic feeling in order to solidify the totalitarian regime. And those are some basic reasons why Hitler was able to come to power, able to stay in power, why people did not immediately dismiss him as the racist lunatic that we of course now know he was. But you cannot judge those kinds of things in the context of the now. You have to look back at then and what were the circumstances then. And circumstantially, people were literally starving to death. So that played a huge role in his rise to power. Now we're going to watch a video that speaks to this issue that we've talked about before about balancing ecology and human needs. And this is taken because of the recent talks in Paris on global climate change. So have a look at this YouTube video, if it loads.
As the world opens the crucial climate change summit, India says the developed world must act on its words and pledge to strive for a balanced, just, and equitable agreement to limit global warming. India is being looked upon as one of the countries at the summit that can make or break a deal. Our correspondent Shweta Bajaj tells us more.
As nearly 150 world leaders, including Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, gather in Paris to reach a deal to limit carbon emissions, India's priority remains getting its people out of poverty. India's Environment Minister Prakash Javadekar said the country is looking to the conference with a positive mindset and is hopeful the developing world won't be forgotten when key decisions are being made.
We are going to Paris for the climate conference with hope and with progressive and proactive stance, because we will not be opposing, but we will be proposing the real changes needed to ensure that we have balanced growth and we have balanced environment.
The Paris summit's aim is to reach a climate pact to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius by curbing fossil fuel emissions. But India maintains that the developed world is losing 2/3 of the available carbon space, and they should now be providing carbon space for the developing countries. Despite this stance, India has massive problems. Its air is dangerous and its water, in many cases, undrinkable. According to the World Health Organization, air pollution is the world's largest environmental health risk, with 13 out of the 20 most polluted cities in the world in India, and number 1 being this very city, Delhi. Meanwhile, rising temperatures mean India's Himalayan glaciers are melting and its farmland is becoming arid, all in the midst of unpredictable, often extreme weather. A recent report by the Centre of Science and Environment says the impact of climate change on India's agricultural sector is more evident than ever. but millions of small and marginal farmers do not have enough safeguards. The last few years have seen extreme weather patterns in India, taking the areas affected by freak weather events to 18.33 million hectares in 2015 from 0.35 million hectares in 2013. And this is having a massive impact on India's economy. More than 60% of country's population is directly or indirectly dependent on agriculture.
When there are extreme weather events that are happening because of global warming or because of climate change, as we say, there can be changes in cyclone patterns. There can be extreme weather events that have happened. Like in March, we had a hailstorm. In Chennai, we have seen recently how there have been unseasonal rains. So all these are effects of climate change. And when most of your population is dependent on agriculture, it makes a major role when the monsoon is affected.
50% of India's emissions come from burning coal. But despite that, India will triple its production of coal by 2030 to provide electricity to 300 million people currently living without it. To mitigate this, India has set an ambitious target of producing 100 gigawatts of solar energy by 2022, a nearly 25-fold increase from its current production level. But coal will still remain India's biggest bane. 1/3 of the world's underprivileged live in India, and the country needs massive energy to power new industries and jobs to pull the millions out of poverty. But climate change has definitely become an urgent issue which needs immediate attention. Getting the right balance will be crucial. Shweta Bajaj, CCTV, New Delhi.
So what you're seeing in that video is what we see happening in international conversations now. Essentially, most of the Western world has industrialized and is now in a post-industrial society. The developing world is trying to industrialize so that they can catch up economically to the Western countries. India is a great example of this. They are currently heavily industrializing, oh goodness, I can't even say that word, industrializing their economy in order to move away from an agrarian society. However, in so doing, they are responsible for most of the world's carbon emissions along with China. So the international voices are asking them to cut back on their carbon emissions, to adopt standards of environmental sustainability, to enact laws that will protect the environment. India is saying we shouldn't be responsible for doing that because we need to catch up economically to the rest of you, and the rest of you got the chance to become industrial societies. Give us that chance, and then we'll worry about the environment. So what you have here is a balance that is becoming actually a major world crisis of whether or not you prioritize immediate concerns over long-term goals. Essentially, it's acknowledged at this point by most who are educated on climate change and understand the role that it plays in economics that environmental sustainability results ultimately in economic viability. So it is better for your economy in the long run to adopt environmentally sustainable practices. Germany is a great example of this. However, you have the politicians' constituents are looking for much more immediate benefit than environmental sustainability offers them. They need the immediate financial output that is usually brought about by short-term fixes and things that are not environmentally sustainable, things that are usually fairly wasteful and that use resources quickly because this produces very quick financial results. So the tension that the politicians are living in now is one of short-term benefits versus long-term benefits. Most constituents respond more to the short-term benefits because they see an immediate impact. However, society at large is going to benefit more from the long-term goals. So they are trying to, as a global community, come to compromises that will achieve environmental sustainability so that, you know, your children won't die of cancer by just breathing. but also allows countries like India and other developing nations that are trying to catch up and reach a level of manufacturing and industrialization that other countries have already are already economically benefiting from. The next balance that we need to discuss is the balance of national security with liberty and rights. This is another one of those examples. Remember, I told you on day one, within politics, you're always going to be doing a cost-benefit analysis. There's never going to be just this win-win. And there's usually a spectrum along which you have to make decisions and decide where along the spectrum do we want to fall, which means I give up one thing in order to achieve another, or I try and find this middle ground where I get a little of both. National security and liberty is one of those great examples. One of the examples that your book looked at and that I had you debate in discussions is Guantanamo. It's pretty easy to demonstrate that the human rights and the liberties of the detainees have been removed if they are held at Guantanamo Bay. However, the question is this justified for the sake of national security? In other words, are the stakes of national security so high that some people do have to suffer in order to protect the liberties and freedoms of other people? Now you could argue in the case of Guantanamo Bay that it has not been justified because, in fact, we haven't received any actionable intelligence from the treatment of the detainees in Guantanamo. But let's assume for a second that we don't know that. Let's go back to when detainees began to be brought to Guantanamo. They were taken there under an assumption that they had information that would harm national security or help national security. They were taken because of associations and suspicions of associations. They were refused due process, partly because due process complicates things. Due process means that you have to present evidence and you have a burden of proof to show that the person you are holding deserves to be held and deserves to have legal action taken against them and deserves to have rights removed, as prisoners do. Prisoners have certain rights removed. We as a society have decided that that is justified if the crime is severe enough. And of course, if the crime is truly terrorism against innocent people, then that is probably just cause for removing certain rights. The question is, without any validation that that is what has happened, is it justified on the assumption that there may be some benefit to national security to perform acts of torture? And I will call them torture because they have been confirmed on an international level and by everybody outside of the United States that acts such as waterboarding are considered torture. Even the United States has considered waterboarding torture when it was conducted against our own soldiers by other nations. So there's really not a debate about whether or not that is. The question is torture justified if it's protecting people or if there's an assumption that it could protect people? This is what the argument surrounding Guantanamo Bay is about, and one that we have to decide for ourselves. How much liberty and how much freedom are we willing to take away from people in order to preserve security? And are we then willing to, within our own lives, accept the removal of those liberties if it means that our own, that the nation's security is improved? One example of this that is a little less violent, perhaps, would be the recent case of the iPhone unlocking. You may have heard of this case. There was a shooting in San Bernardino, California. Two extremists, a husband and wife, killed 14 people. They had phones, which were iPhones, which has an operating system that cannot be easily hacked. Now, the judge looking at the San Bernardino shooting has ordered Apple to unlock this iPhone. Apple is currently refusing to do so. And here we have an NPR story detailing what the controversy is about. But again, it's essentially boiling down to a question of security versus your right to privacy. Sorry, I don't know why my internet's going so slow. It's been pretty good today.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Pitney Bowes. Today's commerce is complex. It's filled with regulations, risk, compliance issues, and chaos. To succeed, you need precision and accuracy, the skills of a craftsman, and the proven skills of Pitney Bowes, the craftsman of commerce. Learn more at pitneybowes.com/craftsman.
Let's hear an intelligence and law enforcement perspective for what to do with one particular iPhone. It's the phone used by one of the shooters in San Bernardino, California. Apple, as you may have heard, is resisting an order to create software to unlock that phone. Philip Mudd is watching all this as an analyst, formerly with the CIA and FBI. He's on the line from California. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Bottom line, should Apple unlock this phone?
Yes, I think they should, but as with any compromise, there should be limits here. I do not believe the U.S. government should ask a company, in this case Apple, to engineer a phone with flaws or what they call backdoors. I do believe for a phone that's already produced in the event of a terror incident or murder where you have dead people, that the company should be asked or required by the court to open the phone with one additional compromise piece, and that is I don't believe they should tell the government how they did it. They should hand over the data, but not compromise themselves by giving the government the method by which they broke the code.
I think Apple's position is that's not a compromise at all. You're saying they shouldn't engineer a phone that's unlockable in advance. They should just go back afterward on rare occasions and do that. But Apple says once we've done this, it's done. It can be done again. Hackers can do it. Other things can happen.
Well, hackers can do it now. I think it could be done again, but think of a scenario. Let's take a Paris attack scenario when you have an attacker or a potential plot in the United States. If that existed and the attack is live and Apple says, well, we won't unlock that phone if that individual has an iPhone. It's hard to envision that scenario. And before we say that's precedent setting, I would say we've done this for decades with emails and phone information before the age of smartphones, and nobody said that fundamentally violated American rights. So I don't know why smartphones are so much different than issuing a court order to, say, Verizon or to Google for email information.
And you raise another interesting point. Our correspondent is reporting this morning that Apple has unlocked phones before, and it's been much quieter and not so controversial. However, we've also heard on this program from Maine Senator Angus King, who's on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he raises a question. Suppose Apple does this. Suppose Apple unlocks the phone. And then China starts asking to unlock iPhones, and Iran starts asking to unlock iPhones, and Russia starts to ask for iPhones to be unlocked. What do you do then?
Yeah, I think there's a small issue there, and there's a big issue. The first issue is I'm not sure an American company should be subject to what the Chinese or the Iranians want, because obviously there's a concern there that they're going to come ask for information about freedom fighters or people who are political oppositionists. I do think there's, in the age of globalization, a bigger conversation to be had across governments, and that is if you had a Chinese company that had information for an American criminal case, what would we do? I think governments have to talk and say we can't limit ourselves to national boundaries in terms of finding the solution to something that's this big. We've got to talk about what we do cross borders.
Well, it's all very well to say that you shouldn't be subject to China's demands, but if you're Apple and you want to sell iPhones in the world's biggest market, I'm sure China could very easily say if you want to sell stuff here, you've got to make it accessible to us.
I think so. That's why I think there has to be a conversation across governments about treaties or agreements on what to do for data. We do that now. We do that when China comes in a criminal investigation in China and says we have a citizen of our country. Is it appropriate for the Americans to cooperate under certain circumstances? The answer is yes. This is just different because it's a digital request. It's not a request for information about a human being in a criminal case.
You have used the word compromise. The FBI Director James Comey put out a statement over the weekend that appeared to call for compromise. He said, let's take a deep breath, stop saying the world is ending, use that breath to talk to each other. Do you really believe there is a compromise to this fundamental question?
I do, and I do think both Apple and the FBI should lower the rhetoric. When you're going into a conversation about compromise, the kinds of statements I've seen come out are too quick to paint both sides into a corner. They've got to talk about what the solution is, not what the bars to solution are.
Okay.
But I think there is a compromise here somewhere.
Philip Mudd, thanks very much. Pleasure talking with you. He is a former counterintelligence official with the FBI, the CIA, and the National Security Council. Now, Apple is speaking out in this case once again today. Tim Cook, the company's CEO, sent an email to employees. The subject line is, "Thank you for your support. It indicates that Apple will continue to resist the court order if possible." Cook acknowledges that Apple could unlock the iPhone, but said that is, quote, "something we believe is too dangerous to do."
So again, this is just reinforcing this idea that you have to make a choice where along the national security and liberty spectrum you're going to fall. What liberties are you going to give up in order to be safer? What securities might you give up? How much more risk might you incur in order to maintain liberty and rights? We see this illustrated in the difference between essentially totalitarianism at one extreme of the spectrum and anarchy at the other. A totalitarian regime controls every aspect of life and as such is very stable and secure. However, the individual has very few rights under such a regime. Anarchy, on the other hand, every individual has lots of personal liberty and rights, hence the lack of security. As you can imagine, when people have nothing to prevent them from doing whatever they want, anarchy, they will do bad things to each other. And this results in very little security, even though there are many liberties. There's the comparison of safety versus liberty, thinking of these as a spectrum. And most societies are going to fall somewhere between these spectrums. Most societies are not going to be totalitarian or anarchist. They're trying to find a balance in there. And as you see with societies that are more socialist, they tend towards the safety side, slightly to the left of center, if you will. And then those who would be libertarian, for example, would tend towards the liberty side, slightly to the right. And this is the balance that has to be achieved by political leaders when they consider what is best, what is the good political life for their citizens. One of the first governments to really take that fully into account, of course, was the United States. Now, this came about as a direct result of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution as well. A lot of people point to the American Revolution because that's our context, but in fact, the French Revolution had more lasting societal impact on the world because at the time, Europe was the center of the economic world and the political world. With the Enlightenment came the separation of religion and politics for the first time. It was commonly assumed that religion and politics would go hand in hand. Enlightenment philosophers, Machiavelli among them, Machiavelli being one of the first among them, brought this into question, said that the two had to exist independently. Of course, Machiavelli's point was there's no way to arrive at a universal standard of morality, so who can say whose version of religion we should all be living under? So he took the more utilitarian view that politics should serve the best interests of the person, and thus the end justifies the means, but it also required a divorce from the control of religion. The Protestant Reformation made the way for this to happen. It paved the way for a break from the Catholic Church. Now, prior to the Enlightenment, the Catholic Church held religious, political, and economic power in Europe. It was just as much a political entity as it is today a religious entity. The Protestant Reformation called that authority into question. It said on a religious level that there were other ways to express religion and faith, and thus there was not... Catholic literally means universal. The Protestant Reformation said, we do not accept this as universal. We think that there is another interpretation of this belief system of Scripture, and therefore broke away from the Catholic Church. That made the way for the questioning of the whole political system that supported the Catholic Church as a political power. As I indicated this before, Machiavelli, he admired high morality, but didn't believe that people could agree on the ultimate standard of what that morality would look like, so he took the utilitarian approach to politics. This means that reason and science become the means of determining truth, rather than superstition or religious tradition. So this is the break from the medieval time where superstition, religion, and religious leaders made all the laws of the land. Now you are transitioning into a time where we want reason to be the primary way that we make decisions and form opinions. And that reason is backed up by science or empirical evidence. With this came the idea of the equality of all classes. That is to say, all people are created equal, was kind of invented with this Enlightenment time, with the French Revolution, which of course, as part of its slogan at the time was equality, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And so they were very vocal in opposing this idea that society is born already divided up into classes, the privileged and the underprivileged, and that all should start from the same basis and have the same rights and have the same access to political and economic power. Now, the French, of course, supported the Americans in their revolution against the British. This secured two republics with Enlightenment ideals of secular government and a division of powers. So the French and the Americans kind of led the way post-Enlightenment into this new age of government that we are now more or less accustomed to. The American Republic, the United States of America, introduced this political innovation, which was the separation of powers. You've probably heard about this. You've all, studied this in high school, the branches of government. We have the legislative branch, we have the executive branch, we have the judicial branch. This is that idea of separate but equal powers. So they are all meant to balance each other by, yes, being influenced by and being able to influence, but also being an entity unto themselves that has specific powers. This prevented a totalitarian or an authoritarian government from taking place because it effectively broke up how laws would be made and enforced. Now let's talk about this last chapter. Again, I think that the communism and democratic socialism chapter, I think your book did a really great job of explaining those concepts, so I'm not going to rehash them. And overall, I think that your book gave you some great examples of the difference between authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, and I just want to touch on some of those big concepts before we end this. One is that this idea of authoritarian rule existed for a long time, and it existed because there was this idea of divine right. This is a long historical precedent, this idea that you are born to a certain position in society. In other words, you were born to be a king. Thus, monarchy was justified because the king had the right given by God to rule in an authoritarian way. Now, again, the Enlightenment played a role in breaking that down because the Enlightenment philosophy said, well, we don't actually think that people are born to high class or low class or status of any kind, but are rather all created equal. Thus, we must adopt populist philosophies and allow everyone to participate in government, not just those who are born into it. And we also think that religion should be separated from our political system, which means that we don't think God determines who rules in a political state. We think that that democratic vote determines who rules in a state. Now, a totalitarian state is where the government controls all aspects of life. So it's at that extreme end, right, of government. It's far away from personal division, far to the security side, where everything is controlled, everything is stable. But in this government, every aspect of your personal life is probably under the control of the government. The authoritarian state, by contrast, the government is not subject to rule of law or populist consent or the Constitution, but it may not control all aspects of life in the same way that a totalitarian government does. So you have an authoritarian state that pretty much does what it wants. It's not subject to any kind of constitution or populist rule, but it doesn't impact things like what you can or can't eat for dinner, which a totalitarian state very much could. Both of these forms of government insist on ultranationalism, which we've talked about. And again, this is essential for this state to exist. It's an extreme loyalty to the system of government and to this idea of a nation and to an identity as being part of that nation. Autarky is the economy. This is an economy that does not rely or is not influenced by any other global influence. So it is an isolated economy. Now we know, of course, from international political economics that this stifles an economy. Cuba and Iran are good examples of that because of sanctions that the U.S. has put on them specifically to limit trade. They weren't isolated by choice. They were isolated because they would not conform to international expectations of international law, of trade agreements, of security, things like producing nuclear weapons. Of course, the United States objected to Castro's authoritarian rule in that country, and so there were sanctions put on them so that they could not engage in international trade. This stifled the economy quite a bit. Now, North Korea, on the other hand, is both sanctioned and is a willing participant in their own autarky. And their economy also is stifled, and they live in a completely totalitarian state, so far as we can tell. Of course, being on the outside, it's a very secretive state, and so it is very difficult to determine what precisely goes on there most of the time. But at the very least, we know that it's isolated. We know that there is vast poverty due to the inability of North Korea to engage in trade and thus boost their economy and push them above a subsistence level economy. Nazism and fascism are an example, of course, of this authoritarian state. These were justified by the popularity of a movement called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is also responsible for the idea of eugenics, which you may have heard of. It was what Hitler used to justify the extermination of Jews. Social Darwinism is based on this idea, Darwin's idea, of course, that of survival of the fittest. Well, social Darwinism went a step further and said that only people of certain physical types should even be allowed to procreate, thus ensuring that humanity is always the fittest and always only allowing the procreation of the fittest. So people with physical disabilities, people with mental disabilities, people of certain races were actually sterilized, and they were unable to have children, to get pregnant or to impregnate by this eugenics movement, which said that only the strongest, the racially superior, the fittest, the smartest should be able to produce children. This is, of course, opposite of the Enlightenment philosophy that all are created equal, and thus is at that extreme other end of the political spectrum. So that wraps up my summary of each of these chapters and the important concepts that I wanted you to know about. Please let me know if anything wasn't clear or if you have further questions. I am always available to answer those for you, and I hope this was helpful. I will talk to you soon.